Hello and welcome to Love Your Library, Hampshire Libraries podcast. I'm Kate Price-McCarthy here with my co-host Hattie Dulac. Hello, Hattie.
Hi, Kate. I'm so glad to be joining you. Have you been reading anything exciting recently?
Well, I have been reading a bit of a classic lately on BorrowBox, one that puts our hot summer into perspective. I'm going to be talking about it a bit more later on in the podcast, so I won't say anything more now. How about you?
Ooh, that sounds thrilling. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about that one. I'm reading a book called Of Women and Salt by Gabriela Garcia. And that is a book about sort of intergenerational family trauma set in Latin America and the States, and kind of focuses on a few different women's lives and families across many different periods of history. So it's really interesting. I think it is a really interesting look at that kind of topic, and the way it's written is really lovely. So I'd really recommend that one. And I'm reading that one on BorrowBox at the moment. So it's probably a good time to say thank you to our supporter BorrowBox, the free library app that allows you to download ebooks and audiobooks straight to your phone or tablet.
All you need to use it is your library membership number and PIN. I always like listening to what books you are reading. You always seem to have something completely different that I've never heard of, while everybody else I know seems to be reading the same thing.
I need to get involved in more book groups and kind of come into the popular book reading group. But yeah, no, I don't know how I find these things. So moving on to our brilliant guest author for this episode, Gayle, whose new book, The Museum of Ordinary People, seems to be flying off the library shelves. So this is one that I did get recommended by you, Kate, and I looked online to see if they had a copy in my local library, and I cannot find it anywhere. It's loaned out in almost all Hampshire libraries at the moment, so it's very popular.
Well, at least there's always the option to reserve it. And I would recommend you do. It's such a pleasure to read. If you're not aware of Mike already, he recently became the first male writer ever to win romantic fiction's top award. But he doesn't just write about kind of hearts and flowers romance and happy ever after. He's also keen to tackle tough and moving topics too.
Yeah, I think I read an article where he was described as a kind of pioneer of like lad lit, and it sounds like he's an author that everyone could read quite happily.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose I'm trying to think of other writers he's been compared with. Nick Hornby, for instance, although I wouldn't say quite exactly that sort of writer, and Tony Parsons, that kind of writer as well. And as you'll hear from the interview, one of the other things that makes him stand out as a romantic fiction writer is he is a writer of colour too. And as he talks about in the interview, that really puts him in a category of his own.
And if, like me, you're keen on getting your hands on a copy of the book, just search our online library catalogue or follow the link in our show notes to see where you can find it.
Later on in the episode, we'll be talking to Donna, who works in a few libraries in the southeast of Hampshire, including Fareham Library and Gosport Discovery Centre. She's going to be telling us about one of her recent reading recommendations. It's a book called The Earth Spinner by Anuradha Roy.
Not to be confused with the Booker Prize-winning author and one of my favourite ever writers, Arundhati Roy.
I'm a big fan of God of Small Things, which I think I'm right in saying, Hattie, is one of your top books of all time. Anuradha Roy isn't an author I've read before, but she was longlisted for the Booker back in 2015, and her latest, The Earth Spinner, came out last year.
Yeah, you're right about that one, Kate. The God of Small Things is one of my favourite books ever. But for now, let's turn to Gayle and his latest book, The Museum of Ordinary People.
And Mike's new book is all about those treasured but valueless objects we keep around us and find so hard to throw away. It's full of hope as well as dealing with the heartbreak of loss. So here's my conversation with Mike, where he does a much better job of explaining what it's all about. Mike, thank you so much for joining me to talk about your new book, The Museum of Ordinary People. Many congratulations. I really enjoyed reading it. So can you start off by telling us a bit about the story?
So the Museum of Ordinary People is about, it's essential. The central character is Jess. She is a receptionist at a big kind of office block and she's a little bit lost. The previous year, she had cleared her mum's house, and she's still reeling a little bit from the loss of her mum. And everything, the story sort of starts when, after clearing her mum's house, she's brought some stuff home, and some of which has sat in the hallway in the kind of the flat that she shares with her boyfriend, and she hasn't done anything with it, and her boyfriend's a little bit afraid to say anything about it. And finally, when kind of the year anniversary kind of comes, he brings it up and sort of says, have you decided what you're going to do with this? And the particular object is a set of encyclopedias. And these encyclopedias mean a lot to Jess. They have no value in themselves, but they mean a lot to Jess emotionally. But really, the reason why they sat in a bag by the front door is because she just doesn't know what to do with them. And she tries to find a home for them and can't, because nobody's interested. They're of no value to them. And not even libraries will take them. And she is just about to get rid of them when a friend of hers tells her, her best friend tells her, about a place called the Museum of Ordinary People. And the Museum of Ordinary People is a museum unlike any other. It's not even a proper museum. It's at the back of a clearance company in Peckham. And she goes to this place and sees the museum and is absolutely bowled away by what she finds, which is lots of items that have been collected together with all attached with labels. So some of the things have been donated, some of the things have just been found, but all of them have this one thing in common, that they all meant something to someone and represented someone who is no longer about or no longer alive. And so she falls in love with this museum and wants to turn it into a proper museum. And really, that's the essence of the story.
Absolutely.
That's the first time I've ever actually explained it like that. I've been wondering, because it's got so many facets that it's quite a hard book to kind of get a handle on. Not in terms of telling the story, but in terms of telling it succinctly, because it's actually much more than this. But it's hard to say.
Well, if that was your first practice run, I think you've done a great job. Yeah, it is lovely the way that does it reignites these kind of past ambitions and love that Jess has for museums and for the idea of being a curator of a museum. Now, I understand that you tend to start your books with an idea and then kind of work out the best way to explore that idea within a story. So could you tell us a bit more about this initial idea? What was that initial idea and how did the idea come to you?
It came, so a friend of mine, he actually works, he and his wife have got this kind of vintage furniture shop. And so he's always on the lookout for vintage furniture. And he was, but he wasn't actually at work at the time. He was just walking on the street and he saw a skip. And, so he's always got to kind of got his eye on the kind of skip and see what's in there. And in the skip so they were clearing out a house, and in the skip were quite clearly bags of things that someone's belongings. So he had a little bit of a rummage, and he found all these kind of letters and postcards and things that had clearly meant something to someone, because they kind of ranged across a number of years. And so these were something that they valued and kept, and yet they'd just been thrown away. And because he'd found them, he sort of felt a sense of responsibility towards them. It's like, what do you do? He was kind of thinking to himself, well, I can't leave them there because that feels wrong. But do I take them home? Because I've got no connection to this person either. And it really made me think about that. And the more I kind of told that story to people, the more people came back to me and said that they'd had similar experiences. A friend of my wife, they moved into a brand new house, and they found, when they moved in, they found a suitcase in the loft that belonged to not the previous owner, but a previous owner, going back several generations, just full of their belongings and full of their mementos. And again, they didn't know what to do with it, because it felt wrong to put it in a skip, but equally they didn't know what to do with it. And so I kind of understood this. I kind of understood the idea that objects that have no value sort of had an importance irrespective, just because they'd been touched people's lives. And so that was my very beginning. I wanted to kind of look at that. And the title came almost immediately because, when you think of museums, you always think of the great and the good, and you always think of, kings and queens and all the important people. But, well, there isn't a museum for ordinary people, for those things that you don't want to throw away, but you can't keep anyway. And so that's how the idea kind of came. And then I thought about Jess and who she was. I knew that she wanted to have some sort of connection to museums, and it just all sort of flourished from there, really, and kind of took on a life of its own.
I'm sure anyone reading this book is going to be thinking about what they would donate to the museum. And I reckon personally, I would nominate an old battered rocking horse that used to be in my grandmother's house. My mother used it when she was 3, and then I have memories of using it myself when I was little. And it's now sitting on my landing, getting in the way, taking up far too much space. But you must have thought yourself, what is there that you would?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and again, it's sort of daft things. My parents are sort of, they're not hoarders really, but they do seem to hang on to things. And I came across a pair of Wellington boots, and these wellies must be at least, I mean, I can't remember these wellies not existing. So they are at least, they're coming to half a century old. And I just remember they just seeing them just evoked just memories of my childhood. For some reason, we just had one pair of wellies, and they were, so if anybody had any kind of welly wearing needs, these were, we just, those were where we went. And they were used for gardening, they were used for when it was snowing, and you need to kind of clear the path, and so they were always there. And I just love the fact that they still exist, and it would be a sad day to kind of see them go after all this time.
Yeah, it is weird, those things that become symbolic like that. Yeah. Now, as a writer, you are known for tackling tough subjects with, I might say, brilliant storytelling skills. And in fact, you were given an Outstanding Achievement Award last year by the Romantic Novel Awards for just those very strengths. But I have to say, despite knowing all of that, I did find I was completely poleaxed at the start of this book, which I really wasn't expecting, to feel within the first few pages to be so affected by Jess's situation. I think it's a position most of us will face at one point, having to clear out their family home. And I have to say, the kind of straightforward way you wrote about it just dropped me headlong into her experience. And so how on earth do you go about capturing this sort of emotional experience in such a direct way?
I think one of the things that I made my mind up a long time ago was that I wasn't going to do, I wasn't going to write in a way that's flowery. I don't do descriptions of clouds or descriptions of trees. I reason that my readers sort of know what trees and clouds look like, and I can't really embellish that. So I like for my characters to sound like real people, and I like for them to talk in a manner that the reader feels that they are listening to a friend tell a story. And because of that, I think you stop thinking about reading that you're reading a book, and you start thinking more that you're listening to a friend. And when you do that, I think you kind of immediately connect with a situation that the people, the characters find themselves in. And that was really important to me. I think there's a place for beautiful sentences and lovely creative, lovely description. But I think sometimes that can kind of get in the way of connecting with your reader and making them feel like this isn't just a character in a book. This is somebody who lives and breathes and could be my next door neighbor, could be my best friend, could be somebody I work with. You really connect with their kind of humanity. And I think that's something that's very important to me.
No, that definitely came across. I also found all the details about what goes into curating a museum really illuminating, finding common themes and telling stories within a museum. And so did you have to do much research to get that kind of thing right?
I did actually, because I didn't really know anything about museums, and so there's a couple of books that I read about curating. Also, there's a fantastic series on BBC4 about the V&A. So you go into, I think they've done about 2 series actually of it, and it's all about the collections in the V&A and how they look after it and the various things. So that was really useful. And also, I've got a very close friend who did a museum curation course at university. So I spoke to her quite a bit as well. So that kind of gave me a little bit of the background of just the kind of logistics of running a museum, about which I knew nothing.
No, it was very interesting. And there's a point where Jess talks about what you choose to have in your home becomes almost a museum of your own history and personality, which I thought was a really interesting idea. And I do think that we use our homes as ways of expressing our identities. So was this like an important theme, the way we tell our stories through everyday objects that mean something to us?
Absolutely. And the thing is, we don't feel like we're curating. We just feel like we're buying things that we like. But all of these things are choices, from the food in the fridge to the pictures on the wall. These are things that we've decided about. And so these objects in themselves tell a story about what's important to you, what you like, what you don't like. And so, when Jess goes into her mum's home, so just for the listeners, just so they know, while we get the story of the Museum of Ordinary People, we also get the story of Jess, how she arrived at her mum's home to clear it, and we kind of return to that story throughout the main story. It's sort of weaved in that week that she spends dismantling her mum's home. And so when she approaches different things, everything tells a story. The clothes tell a story. Even the kind of broken ornament in itself tells a story, because it's a story about Jess and her best friend and how they knocked it over and glued it back together again, thinking that her mum hadn't noticed. And so everything tells a story. And so when you do something as heartbreaking as having to clear a parent's home, you are reliving all of those moments that connected to those objects. And you're also thinking about how they came into your life as well, and the person who brought them in and why they brought them in, and what those objects mean. So it's quite a heartbreaking thing to do. And I suppose it's one of those things that when I look at my friends, in my 30s, there were few people, there were only a very small, limited number of people who had that experience. And then as we've kind of got older, more and more, and soon we're getting to the stage where it's not uncommon for people of my generation to be clearing their parents' things. So it's almost a rite of passage, I suppose. And you feel like once you kind of get to the age of 40 that you're done with rites of passage, until, of course, you kind of tip over to the point where your parents start to pass away, and you realise that actually there are a few more rites of passages that are left ahead. And so it was important to me to kind of detail that.
Now, there's a few questions that I wanted to ask about gender and race, but please stop me if you feel I'm going over about which.
No, by all means, yeah, go for it, yeah.
And also if you're sick and tired of talking about it. But anyway, now I've read before that if you Google Black British male romantic fiction writing, you'll arrive at Mike Gayle, because there really is that many other writers who fit that description. So I'm quite interested in the perspective that gives you and your readers. Now, it's difficult because on the one hand, talking about race and racism is obviously incredibly important and is something you've tackled in your previous book. But on the other hand, it's also great to have a main character who's a woman of colour where race isn't the subject of the book. So is this something that's important to you?
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's something that's always been important to me. I just think, obviously there is a place for discussions about race, but equally there's a place for discussions by people of colour about things with nothing to do with race. And I think it's really important. It's a 360-degree experience, and white writers and white non-black authors get to write about the whole spectrum of life. And sometimes it feels like black writers can be, well, okay, this is your piece of the pie that you can write about, but the rest is ours. And it's very important to me to actually go, actually, no, I'm going to claim that whole 360 degrees. So I will write about whatever I want to write, and I will stake that claim. And I think it's important because I think it's easy to kind of get pigeonholed. And I'm part of a thing that's been going on where I've been talking to publishers, and they are desperate to get black writers and people of colour to be writing about crime fiction, romance fiction. And it's important to kind of get that message out that you don't have to be pigeonholed. You can write about your own experience. You can write about fantasy, sci-fi. All the genres are open to you, and don't feel that you have to be channeled in one direction. And so it's important, just the very existence of books like the Museum of Ordinary People. If I can just see one person who read it and just go, oh, right, okay, this has got a character who's a person of colour, and it's not about race, and that's great. It's fantastic. So it is important to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of guessing that I'm using the word romantic fiction very broadly. The default for characters, certainly main characters, is that they are going to be white. And so I don't know whether would you go as far as it gives you sort of satisfaction to be able to subvert that default and
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, for a long time, I didn't talk about race because I was determined not to be pigeonholed. And so my leisure girlfriend and Mr. Commitment and turning 30, the characters, I just talked about the characters and their experiences. I didn't talk about race. And the interesting thing is that people reading them, because I didn't specifically talk about race, people would naturally assume that the characters were white. And I would say, well, why would you do that? You've seen the cover of my picture on the back, and I'm quite clearly black. So why would you assume that they're white? And you just go, because you don't say. And you go, well, hang on a second, right? So in the early days, I used to get compared to Nick Hornby and kind of Bridget Jones and all the rest of it. And you kind of go, well, at what point in a Nick Hornby book, or indeed in Bridget Jones, does any of the characters say, here I am, I'm a white woman doing white things? They don't. They just get on with their lives. And it was really important to, and again, I get people talking to me, especially in the early days, just like go, oh, I didn't realise you were black. And I go, well, I am. And I didn't realise you were white either. So, look at us, we're both surprised. But yes, I just, it does give me a great deal of pleasure to kind of just challenge that idea that if it's not stated, unless it's stated the character is white, I just think, well, actually, no. Am I making life difficult for you? Yes, probably. But it's about making those assumptions. Why are we making those assumptions? And are those assumptions useful and helpful? And I don't think they are.
Very good. Yeah, absolutely. Now, of course, obviously, it's also a little less usual to have a man writing fiction about, well, I suppose with the exception of people like Nick Hornby, about feelings and emotions and a bit of romance too, and also to be writing them from a woman's perspective. Did your early career as an agony uncle on a teen magazine help prepare you for this? Or maybe you were drawn to that job in the first place because you've always been interested in ordinary people's day-to-day emotional lives?
I think the thing is, as an author, I think it's really important that you've got to be able to write as both genders. You've got to be able to do that. It's a little bit like being a portrait artist, but secretly you can't do noses, and so you just never draw noses. It's bonkers if you can't write a convincing female character as a male, or you can't write a convincing male character as a female. You get what I'm trying to say. Then you're in the wrong job. Our job is to talk about people. If you can't talk about people and do a convincing job of it, you are in the wrong job. People always think, ask me, is it difficult or was it difficult? And is it about getting into a different mindset? And it's my job. It's my job to observe people. It's my job to create convincing characters. And if I can't do that, then I shouldn't be a writer.
Although I did read somewhere that your one sticking point, though, was what women might wear. And that
this is true. I'm not great at addressing my female characters, and I have been known before now to go to the next catalogue and just say, "Oh, this person is wearing an asymmetrical top with a long gypsy skirt or something like that," just because I literally have no idea about those things. So yes, emotionally, I get it. Clothes-wise, that is my weakness, but I do my research. That's the important thing.
Exactly. Now, look, we're talking today just after 2:00 in the afternoon, and I understand that's typically the time that you clock off from your daily writing stint. So could you tell us a bit about what your normal writing day for you involves, and maybe what you're working on at the moment?
Okay, so I tend to start about 8:00 in the morning. So kids off to school, dog's been fed normally. So I come up here. This is my office, and I'll start work. And depending on where I am in a book, I mean, I'll always be here between, generally speaking, Monday to Friday. I'm always here from 8 until 1. And I tend to. My target is, and again, I suppose it depends where I am in the cycle. If I'm writing a first draft, my target is writing a chapter, and because I'm very much a planner, so I not only do I know the beginning, middle, and end of my books, but I also know the beginning, middle, and end of every chapter. So generally speaking, I know where I'm going with my chapter. So I'll sit down and I'll do a little plan for how the chapter's going to look or go. And generally speaking, I'll hit the target. Sometimes I don't, but I it's not the end of the world. But generally speaking, I'll make sure I'll get to. I can write a chapter within my kind of daily work target, and then I think after that, I'll walk the dog, have some lunch, walk the dog, and I'll do anything that's not sitting in front of a computer. I was talking to someone yesterday, and sitting down is possibly one of the worst things that you could do for your body, and we're all of us sitting down too much. So I as soon as I finish, I have to go and walk and do something else and try not to sit down, and that's really important to me. But again, my typical day changes, as I said, depending on where I am with the book. So sometimes, the very beginning of the book, I'm planning. So I'm very much a planner. So I plan, as I said, I plan everything, generally speaking. So I might be planning, and if I'm not planning or I've done that planning, I'll start writing and I'll get a first draft down. And then once I've got a first draft down, my wife will read it and she'll come back with lots of suggestions and lots of, she's always the first person who kind of reads my book. And then I'll do a second draft, and then it will go to my agent and editors, and they might have a few notes as well. So I'll take that back, and then there might be a third draft. So it's never just one thing. It all depends on where I am in the cycle.
So where
am I right now? Right now, I have had one of my best years ever. So I had an idea for a new book. I started it must be in January, and I wrote an outline for it and planned it all out, sent it to my agent and editor, and they both loved it. And so I started working on it, and I finished it, and my wife read it and she loved it. And so we did it. I did some corrections and took her notes on. So I sent it to my agent and editors. And so that's where I am at the minute now. So probably I'm just waiting for notes from my agent and editor. But normally it takes me about 12 months door to door to kind of get a book in shape. And this one, I mean, we're only 6-7 months in, and it's in a much better state than I thought it would be. So I'm really happy, actually. So yeah, all being well, I'll get some notes back, and it should be another month, a month and a half to turn it around.
Fantastic. We'll look forward to that. All right.
Thank you.
What a pleasure Mike was to chat with. He's such a nice man. I heard him on Radio 4 the other day, and all the listeners were phoning in to say what they'd like to donate to the museum. So what about you, Hattie? Have you thought about what you might send in?
That is a very intriguing question, I think, Kate. I am thinking long and hard. I've got a lot of things in my house that is just kind of useless junk, but probably the most useless of all are the torn to pieces festival wristbands I used to collect when I went to festivals. And I've kind of graduated from having them on my wrist for years at a time, which I think is actually quite disgusting. But they're now snipped away and kept in a little box somewhere, but they don't really serve any purpose, or I never look at them. They just exist.
So that would make a great donation to the Museum of Ordinary People. Perfect. So now it's time to hear from Donna, who works as a library team assistant in a few different library branches in the Fareham and Gosport area.
We'll be speaking to her about her recommended read, The Earth Spinner, and chatting about some other books that we've read recently.
Hi, Donna, and welcome to the podcast.
Right. Hi, thank you.
Lovely to have you.
So you're a library team assistant at quite a few of our libraries. Would you be able to tell us a bit about where you work and what they're like?
Well, I work between 5 different libraries, 2 larger ones, Fareham and Gosport, and 3 smaller ones, Stubbington, Loxford and Porchester. The smaller libraries tend to be more friendly, I would say, and more face-to-face, and lots of questions asked. And more people would ask you to recommend books as well, I think, in the smaller ones.
Yeah. So this will be an absolute breeze for you then?
Hopefully.
And at the moment, we're right in the middle of our summer reading challenge, of course. So are all the libraries kind of ramped up and ready to go with that?
Oh, definitely. Generally, it's been extremely busy, particularly when it first started. And we have seen our overflowing shelves going to half empty, 3/4 empty in places where so many people have taken out books. So that's been really lovely to see.
Yeah, I know there's usually really good supplies on Borrow Box of children's books as well. So if anyone is stuck and can't get the book they really want, then definitely worth having a look at the children's shelves on Borrow Box.
Definitely.
So yes, on to our book recommendations. Donna, would you like to tell us a bit about the book you've chosen to talk about today and why it is you've chosen it?
Right, I've chosen the book The Earth Spinner by Anuradha Roy. So 2 young girls in India, they are given rides to school by a rickshaw driver who also happens to be a potter. He's a Hindu and he falls in love with a Muslim woman. But what I liked about the idea of this was that it wasn't a huge theme throughout the book. He'd fallen in love, she happened to be a Muslim woman. And it was sort of overcoming some of the prejudices without making that the central theme of the book. I mean, there have been lots of books about the suffering and hardship that people have suffered through prejudice. And this book didn't try to do that. So he has a dream of a huge horse, and there's all fire and everything in it. And he then recreates the horse. And this sparks off some discontent and causes some problems within the village. So I think it would be a spoiler if I add more to that. But the young girl then ends up, she works really hard at school, and she ends up getting a scholarship to go to England. And she comes across a little bit of prejudice. So there's lots to think about in the book. It really made you think about all the issues without detracting from the writing. And the reason I chose this was because I was asked to read some books for the Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize. And this was one of the many books I read and happened to be my favourite one. It seemed to tick all the boxes for me. It was it did include adventure, and we were asked for it to go on a journey, and the people in the book went on different journeys. They went on physical journeys from India to England, and one of them went in other countries around the world. They also went on creative journeys as they were working with pottery, and that was a large part of the story. And they also went on a sort of discovering themselves journey as well. So it seemed to cover all those things. And another reason I chose this one was because I used to do some ceramics, and it was lovely to actually read a book about it. Not something I've really come across very often. However, I think if you had no interest in pottery, it still would have been a lovely book. And she wrote exceptionally well. It was almost like poetic. So those are all the reasons that I chose it.
So tell me a bit more about that prize you're talking about. So what was...
The Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize. It's all obviously adventure. It is sponsored by the Wilbur Smith NISO Foundation, and they ask librarians to read a number of books to help them long and short list for the award. And again, adventure is probably not the category that I thought would be my favourite. But then I found out that the winner the previous year was Miss Benson's Beetle. And I had read that just by coincidence, and it was a lovely book, and I'd really enjoyed it. So I thought, oh, maybe there's going to be rather more to this than I at first thought.
That sounds like a really interesting project to get involved in. And it is great when you're pushed to do something that's a bit outside your comfort zone when it comes to reading. So am I right in thinking, because I haven't read this yet, it sounds really good, sounds absolutely up my street, but it kind of, am I right in thinking it shifts in narration style? It's got some bits seem to be like diary entries, and then other bits are letters. And is that something that you thought worked well?
I did, because I think it was pretty much all in the present tense, which I didn't think would appeal to me as much, but she wrote it so beautifully. It was simple yet poetic. It was an interesting style to write in. That's what I enjoyed most about it, and some of the images that she used. And she talked about her father, and I think he was interested in geology and talked about all the different rocks. And she said that even though they didn't really listen, they weren't interested, somehow that seeped into them, and it gave them memories of their father after he died later on.
I really like the way it explores, from what I've read, what it means to be a creator and the creative force, but also looking at kind of old myths and looking at them in new ways. I think all of that sounds really fascinating.
That's such a theme that comes out of a lot of the books that we discuss, actually, the kind of engaging with old myths and creating them into something new. It seems really popular. What else do you think, kind of along that vein, do you think listeners will really like about this book?
Well, I hope, obviously, the story of the book would keep them engaged, and just the way it's written, like I said, the way you could almost visualise it as you're reading it. And she really evokes the places that the story is set in. And you can just visualise it as you read it. So I found that really appealing. She brought it all to life, just as you would hope that an author would do.
Well, I've not read anything by this writer before, so for me, this is a great recommendation. So we've been talking about The Earth Spinner by Anuradha Roy. And Hattie, have you got a reading suggestion for us?
I do. So it's slightly on theme in that it kind of also follows the journeys kind of spiritually, emotionally, and in one case kind of physically. And it also involves that kind of cross-continental journey. So I've read China Room by Sanjeev Sahota, who has written this book, and it's set across 2 timelines, which is another common theme on this podcast. We always see books that have, your early 20th century to your late 20th century, but that's what this book does. So the initial timeline follows the story of Mahar, who's a new bride in 1920s rural Punjab. A family of brothers is set to get married, and she's one of the women who's been arranged to marry one of these 3 brothers. And the way that the family traditions and the household is set up is that really these new brides are treated as kind of maids, as servants, kind of really not very interactive in a sense of power in the household, to the point where the only interactions they have with their husband are so limited that she doesn't know which of the brothers is hers. And it's kind of about her grasping with that power struggle in that timeline. And it's got an even more specific, but maybe a bit of a tenuous link, in that it's called The China Room, and The Earth Spinner is a book about pottery. So we've got that. But yeah, so the reason it's called The China Room is because these three now sisters are kind of confined to this china room where they mostly perform some kind of household duties. And then it comes to not quite present day, it comes to 1999, where we have another main character, a man who is living in England, facing lots of racial abuse. He's the son of an immigrant, and he's kind of become addicted to drink and to drugs, and he decides to move back to live with his family in India and try and overcome the problems that he has with substance abuse. And within that, he moves back to his family's ancestral home in rural Punjab and ends up discovering the China Room and you know, kind of uncovering the mystery of what happened there. And I think it's a interesting book because, again, like you said with the Earth Spinner, it doesn't quite make some of these trials and tribulations the central focus of the book. They're just kind of there, they're parts of life, you know. But I think the themes that really come out in this one are the power struggles, you know, who holds power in families, in society, and how do people resist that power. I think that's a really key theme to it as well. And then also that kind of sense of physical memory, you know, with a room that belonged to an old family member, how that connects him to his present in the more modern timeline is a really interesting thing that the book handles quite well, I think. So Sanjeev Sahota, I think he's Booker Prize nominated, potentially shortlisted, but I'll have to fact check that. But yeah, I think it was really beautifully written, really powerful, and I would definitely recommend it to listeners. Yeah.
And I also found The Earth Spinner quite uplifting. I think there are a lot of books at the moment that they just deal with problems, and you want to sort of find solutions, issues, people moving on and getting on with things, which is a bit what we need at the moment, I think. Just that sort of resilience to move on and be positive and, you know, do what you can with the circumstances that you're under at that particular time.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think he's... this is the second. This was shortlisted for Booker, but it's his. He's had another shortlisting. The Runaways was another of his that was shortlisted for the Booker, and I noticed that one of the authors that have been championing him is Camilla Shamsi, who wrote Home Fire, which I really loved. So I would say that is another book I would strongly recommend as well.
I think Camilla Shamsi also did a positive review of The Earth Spinner.
Oh, small world.
Yeah, exactly. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your book recommendation then, Kate?
Well, I've decided to talk about a group of 3 books, which I'm afraid aren't really linked to any of the themes from The Earth Spinner. I've recently read The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna, which is all about the exodus from the Dust Bowl states to California in the 1930s Depression. And it follows Elsa and her family, who leave everything behind to make this terrible journey. And then they try, against the odds really, to make a better life for themselves in California. At the time I was reading it, not only did I keep thinking how lucky we are that we are not in that situation that they were in 1930s Dust Bowl, you know, that we can, for the moment, still turn on a tap and get water. But I did keep thinking about Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, which, of course, tells exactly the same sort of story. But Steinbeck was writing in the 1930s at the time it was going on. So immediately I finished the Kristen Hanna book, I moved straight on to the Steinbeck version, which is an absolutely extraordinary written book. I've never read it before. And it's really hard when you read it to realise that it was written 80 years ago. It seems such a kind of modern novel in the style it's written in. It kind of reminded me of Irvine Welsh, the way that people's dialects are reproduced exactly on the page. And it had all this incredibly genuine, specific detail that really made you feel that you could see exactly what was going on in people's lives. And very sadly, the sort of themes it's talking about of these huge forced migrations and this extreme poverty, and about the prejudice these people felt when they got to California, is more relevant than ever today. I said I was going to talk about 3 books because I'm now fascinated, having read those 2, to go back to the source material for both of these novels, which is a book called Whose Names Are Unknown. And this is a book that was written by a writer called Sonora Babb, who was a woman who worked with these displaced Dust Bowl migrants at the time. And Steinbeck read and used all her notes, I believe without her knowledge, and his version of the story was so successful that any plans they had to publish her book were completely abandoned. And it was 65 years later that her book finally went to print. So I feel now I've got to read that novel. I guess it's never going to be written as well as Steinbeck, but but it's interesting to really go back to that real source material.
Have you read any of those books, Donna?
No, I've read several Steinbeck ones, but not those particular ones.
Yeah. Sounds interesting. I feel like we're also in the middle of a heat wave right now, and I think those kind of stories with like oppressive heat and drought it always ramps up the tension.
Yeah, and it's wonderfully told, the Steinbeck version in particular, the huge detail he goes into about the decisions that somebody, when they've got to leave their home suddenly, what do I take with me? And people start thinking, well, what about that vase that our aunt bought for us at that county fair? No, that's ridiculous. Of course I can't bring that. And the children can just bring one toy with them. And how do they choose that? And you know that across the world, people are having to make those sorts of decisions every day, and how they feel a sort of sense of loss of identity as they leave everything behind and just abandon it or burn it or sell it for pennies. Because nobody's going to give them any money for it. It's absolutely an extraordinary story that is so based in people's lived experiences.
So before we head off and spend our afternoons in some very deep heat, are there any other books or any other sort of library services that you'd like to give a special mention to, Donna?
Books, like I said, I enjoyed Miss Benson's Beetle. The Librarian, of course, had to read that one when I started this job, and that was a pleasant surprise because I thought it was going to be a lighter book than it was, and it was beautifully written. So that was a lovely book. And The Plant Hunters, which was another one I read, that was by T.G. Mogford. That was another one I read for the Royal Smith Adventure Prize. The Vacation, which surprised me, by John Mars, and that was another interesting one. And finally, another one, Tide by Sarah Freeman. Those are some that I particularly enjoyed. And I nearly talked about The Citadel today, but I thought that was a very well-known book, and I thought people would know that one already. But that's one of my favourites as well.
Oh, fantastic. Well, maybe we'll get you back on to talk about that one another time.
It's always great to have a mixture of old and new, and I love a short book every so often. It's quite nice to read one that you can get immersed in just for a day or so. Thank you very much for joining us, Donna, and we definitely will really look forward to speaking to you again soon, when we hope to get another selection of some great recommendations. We'll make sure that we put the books that list of books that you recommended into our show notes, so that anyone who wants to look them up has got links.
Lovely. Right. Thank you very much for speaking to me.
What a lovely guest to have, and some fantastic book options too. The Earth Spinner is definitely going on my reading list.
Yeah, I'll be working through some of her other recommendations as well. It's nice that she picked out The Librarian, which is a book that we discussed in an earlier podcast episode. Again, we can put a link to that in our show notes.
Yeah, how could we not? It's Love Your Library. And before we go, we've just got time to tell you about the Hampshire Library Summer Reading Challenge, which we did mention a little bit earlier in the episode when we spoke to Donna.
During the summer holidays, if you're not already aware, children across Hampshire are being challenged to read or listen to 6 books of their choice. And for this great achievement, they'll get a certificate and a medal to display with pride.
It's a fantastic way to keep children's literacy skills up during the summer when they're not at school, as well as providing parents with a free activity to keep kids busy.
Find out more about this year's challenge on the Kids Zone area of our website. You'll find a link to that in our show notes as well. And while you're there, have a browse of some of the activity sheets and resources too. We've got jokes, puzzles, spot the difference, dot to dots, all kind of things to keep your kids busy over the summer holidays.
Well, that's about everything from us. Thanks once again to Gayle for chatting with us and to Donna for her book recommendations.
Thanks for listening. I'm Kate Price-McCarthy.
And I'm Hattie Dulac.